The sky was the color of wet ash when Eleanor Fletcher arrived at Grendel's Bay. The train had let her off at a lonely platform surrounded by dunes and marsh reeds, where the only sound was the hollow rustling of cattails brushing against the fence. It was late autumn, the sort of season where things felt suspended in time. Leaves had already fallen, and the skeletal branches scratched faintly at the windows of the waiting room. The air had that peculiar stillness that belongs only to quiet towns on the edge of the world. She carried a suitcase and a journal. That was all. Eleanor wasn't the kind of woman who typically traveled alone. A librarian by trade and disposition, she lived her life by quiet routines. Morning tea, cataloging rare books, evening walks under the amber glow of street lamps. But something had drawn her to Grendel's Bay, not out of wanderlust or rebellion, but something older. A letter, perhaps. A whisper in the ink of her grandfather's journals, which she had discovered after his death. A story he never told anyone, about a place he used to visit years before she was born. The townsfolk called it simply the Bay. There was no taxi waiting. Eleanor didn't expect one. She walked instead along a cracked coastal road that meandered through fog and thistle. Seagulls circled overhead in lazy spirals, their cries muted as if wrapped in cotton. Ahead, the town emerged like an old memory. Faded paint, shuttered porches, a lighthouse standing solitary at the farthest edge like a solemn watchman. Grendel's Bay was once a whaling town. Long before tourism had touched the nearby coastlines, it had thrived off the sea, ships, oil, salt. But now it was half forgotten, nestled between craggy bluffs and the slow encroachment of the tide. She had booked a room at the Widow's Rest Inn, an old sea captain's home, converted into a boarding house. The woman who owned it, a thin, pale figure with eyes like clouded glass, greeted her with a nod and a key. No small talk, no pleasantries. Just silence and the soft creak of floorboards as Eleanor made her way to the second floor. The room smelled of lavender and mothballs. There was a fireplace, cold and unused. A window looked out to the sea, which stretched gray and endless toward a horizon that seemed farther than it should be. On the writing desk was an oil lamp, half full, and a stack of yellowed letters bound in ribbon. She didn't open them. Not yet. Instead, Eleanor sat in the armchair, lit the lamp, and took out her grandfather's journal. She turned to the page with the sketch, a crude map of the town, with a red circle around a spot labeled Lantern Hill. Beneath it, in faded pencil, were the words, "Find the Keeper." The wind tapped softly at the window like a polite knock. She closed the book and let the stillness settle around her. There was something about this place, a gentleness in its decay, as if the past had chosen to linger here just a little longer, like the scent of pipe smoke in an old coat. It didn't feel haunted, exactly, just forgotten. And in the forgetting, something had grown. She felt it most acutely when she visited the old library the next day. It stood near the harbor, a squat stone building with iron lanterns flanking the door, and a plaque that read, "Established 1846, for the light of the mind." Inside, it smelled of brine and aged leather. The librarian, a soft-spoken man named Harold, seemed startled by her presence, though he quickly offered tea and a dusty visitor's log. "Not many come through in November," he said, stirring his cup with a silver spoon. "Most wait until summer, when the fog lifts." "I'm not here for the view," Eleanor replied. "I'm researching someone. The lantern keeper." Harold's hand paused. "That old tale?" he said carefully. "No one's asked about him in years." Eleanor leaned forward slightly, her voice low. My grandfather mentioned him. Said he stayed here decades ago. Said there was something strange about Lantern Hill. He never explained what. Harold's eyes, a soft gray like sea-worn pebbles, regarded her with cautious curiosity. Then, slowly, he rose from his chair and walked to a narrow cabinet behind the desk. He withdrew a single leather-bound book, the local registry, old and brittle. He opened it to a marked page. There used to be a keeper. His name was Thomas Delaney. Watched the lighthouse during the storms. Said he could see things in the fog no one else could. Figures, faces, lights where there shouldn't be any. Eleanor listened, her breath quiet. Then one night, Harold continued, he vanished. Left his lantern burning in the watchtower. They never found him. Folks say he's still there, or at least something is. He closed the book with a soft thump. But that was 60 years ago. Eleanor spent the afternoon reading in the library's back alcove, flipping through maritime logs, local papers, and a single curious volume labeled Ghost Lights and Sea Myths of the Eastern Coastline. One passage caught her eye. Lantern Hill has long been a place of strange sightings. Phosphorescent lights that drift over the moor, voices carried on windless nights, and the persistent illusion of footsteps behind one's own. Some say the hill is hollow, or that it remembers things. That night back in her room, Eleanor stood by the window and looked toward the lighthouse. Its light was no longer functional, extinguished decades ago, yet she thought she saw a faint shimmer. Not a beam, but a pulse, a suggestion. She lit the oil lamp beside her bed. Outside, the wind picked up again, a low rhythmic sigh that ebbed and flowed like the tide. Sleep came slowly, and just before it did, she heard it. A soft clink of glass, like a lantern being set on wood. Somewhere far off in the fog, and footsteps, gentle, purposeful, coming from Lantern Hill. The next morning arrived veiled in mist. Eleanor woke early, wrapped herself in a wool shawl, and descended the creaking stairs of the Widow's Rest Inn. The front room was quiet, save for the low hum of a radio playing something old, a cello perhaps, or a deep, mournful horn drifting in from another century. She stepped outside. The town was shrouded in fog so thick that the ocean was no longer visible, though the scent of salt lingered in every breath. The lighthouse, Lantern Hill, loomed in silhouette, barely visible through the gauze of morning haze. Something about its posture struck her, not threatening but watchful, waiting. She made her way slowly along the path leading up the hill. The road twisted upward, weaving through stands of wind-bent pine and tangled roots. Here and there were broken stone steps partially buried in moss and fragments of wrought iron fence that had long since surrendered to rust. Crows perched along the branches, utterly silent. Halfway up, Eleanor paused to catch her breath. There, set into the hillside, stood a crumbling bench and an old plaque, nearly unreadable. She brushed away a layer of grime and deciphered the inscription, "To those who kept the light, and to those who never returned." It wasn't a dedication. It was an epitaph. At the summit, the lighthouse emerged from the fog like a phantom tower. Up close, it was taller than it looked from the town, built of stone, weathered, with narrow slits for windows that stared out like blind eyes. The heavy door was ajar, swaying faintly on its hinges. She pushed it open. Inside, the air was dry, stale, but not dead. Dust hung in shafts of light, disturbed only by the hush of her own footsteps. A narrow, spiral staircase climbed the circumference of the walls. Eleanor's hand grazed the rail, cold and iron, worn smooth. She ascended slowly. Each step creaked, not loudly, but in a rhythm that became oddly comforting. 1, 2. 1, 2. A heartbeat in wood and stone. Near the top, the air shifted. Warmer somehow. The smell of old oil, soot, and salt filled her nostrils. Not unpleasant, more like the residue of a once-used hearth. And then she saw it. The lantern. It sat on a wooden table in the center of the room, still and dark, yet the glass was spotless, as if cleaned just yesterday. Around it were notebooks, dozens of them, with cracked leather spines, everyone stamped on the front with a neat, looping T.D. Thomas Delaney. Eleanor reached for the topmost book and opened it. October 19th, 1957. The light flickered again last night. No cause, no wind. Just the flicker, like a blink from something large and unseen. I checked the bulb. No faults. Nothing explained it. October 22nd. I saw them again, figures in the fog just beyond the reef. Not fishermen, not boats. Shapes. They don't move like people do. They drift. The entries became more fragmented after that. Lantern burned for 9 hours straight without oil. Fog smelled different. Not salt. Like ash? Dreamed of the tunnel again. Under the hill. Voices calling upward. Can't tell if I'm asleep when I hear them. Eleanor looked around the lantern room. There was no electricity, no oil drums. Yet the lantern, the same lantern from her dream, stood as if waiting to be lit. She didn't touch it. Instead, she sat near the window, notebook on her lap, and began writing. Not out of habit, but necessity. The place asked for it, a quiet request. The way libraries and sacred spaces ask for silence. She wrote what she had seen, what she had felt. The wind had no direction here. The light, even during day, seemed to hesitate. The fog didn't move. It lingered. After an hour or more, she descended. The stairway felt slightly shorter on the way down, though she counted the same number of steps. At the base, she turned to look back at the lantern room. The door at the top was closed. She hadn't closed it. That evening, she dined alone at the inn. The dining room was lit with gas lamps and filled with the scent of baked fish and rosemary. Across the room sat a man in a tweed coat and scarf reading a folded newspaper. He glanced up once, met her eyes, and gave a slight nod. His presence felt familiar, though she couldn't place it. Later, as she returned to her room, she found a note slipped under her door. No envelope, just a single folded page. Inside, in precise cursive, were the words, "You saw it, didn't you? The light that isn't there." No name. No address. Eleanor didn't sleep right away that night. She sat by the window with the oil lamp glowing gently beside her, watching the lighthouse. The fog was thinner now, and in the distance, the lantern room gleamed with a faint golden glow, but it wasn't powered, and she hadn't lit it. Something, or someone, had. And the light pulsed, slow and rhythmic, like a signal. Not random, not flickering, but measured, almost like it was calling to her. The next day came wrapped in a heavy stillness. Grendel's Bay had always been a quiet place, but this morning was quieter still, as though the entire town was holding its breath. The waves below the cliffs moved sluggishly. Even the gulls, so common and noisy the day before, were absent. Eleanor made her way back to the library. She had barely slept. The image of the lantern, glowing from the top of Lantern Hill, without fire or bulb, had taken root in her mind. It hadn't been frightening, not exactly. It was more like a question that had grown legs and followed her into her dreams. When she arrived, Harold was already sorting books behind the counter. He greeted her with a tired smile, one that tugged faintly at the corners but never quite reached his eyes. "Couldn't sleep either?" she asked. "No," he said, running a finger along the spine of an old catalog. Fog was thick, the kind that settles in your bones. Eleanor hesitated, then leaned forward. "Someone left a note under my door, about the lantern." Harold didn't respond at first. Then he nodded, slowly. "It happens to those who go up there. Happens. You start noticing things. Messages, whispers, nothing loud, just the sort of things you think you dreamed until you find proof you didn't." He pulled a drawer open and handed her a file. An old manila folder filled with fading carbon copies of letters, all dated between 1960 and 1963. She flipped through them slowly. "To whom it may concern," I hear them again. "Beneath the floorboards, even in the daytime, they are digging, not with tools, with hands." GM, former caretaker, 1961. "Why does no one speak of the hollow? It breathes. When I sleep, I hear it inhale." Anonymous? Undated. "The keeper's lantern burned again last night. There's no oil, no wick. The flame bends toward the sea." AW, 1962. Eleanor looked up. "Who were these people?" "Caretakers, visitors, dreamers. They all came looking for something." Harold's voice dropped. "Few found peace. Most left. Why stay?" He smiled faintly. "Not everyone wants answers. Some of us just want to remember the questions." Outside, the fog began to clear in patches. The outline of the lighthouse returned, stark and monolithic, and Eleanor found her gaze pulled to it like the moon draws the tide. "Do you believe any of it?" she asked softly. Harold paused. "I believe the land remembers, and sometimes it tells us what it remembers, if we're quiet enough to listen." That afternoon, she walked again, not to the lighthouse, but down to the edge of the shore. The sea had pulled back unusually far. Jagged rocks jutted out from the sand like bones, and in the distance, something caught her eye. A series of old stone pillars, half submerged in the surf, forming a broken ring. She approached cautiously. At the center of the ring was a narrow opening, partly collapsed and slick with salt and moss. A tunnel. The edges were carved. Not natural. Weather-worn inscriptions circled the lip of the entrance, too faded to read clearly. But one word stood out in English, etched deeper than the rest. Remember. She crouched beside the tunnel and reached in with her hand. The air that flowed from it was warm, humid, and carried a scent she couldn't place. Earth, yes, but something sweeter beneath, like cedar or dried flowers long forgotten in a box under the bed. Eleanor didn't go inside, not yet. That night she returned to her room and lit the oil lamp. The flame danced gently, casting soft shadows on the wall. The town was asleep. The inn was still. She opened her grandfather's journal again, scanning pages she had previously ignored. And there it was, scrawled in the margin of an entry dated June 12th, 1956. It's not the light that haunts the hill. It's the space beneath it. She looked out the window. The lighthouse was dark again. No glow from the lantern. No signal from the watchroom. And yet, in the distance, across the black waters and shivering reeds, she saw something else. A flicker. A brief pulsing shimmer just offshore. It moved with the tide like a submerged heartbeat. A light that wasn't reflected, that wasn't seen, but remembered. Somewhere in the dark something had stirred, and tomorrow she would return to the tunnel. Eleanor awoke before dawn. The fog was heavier that morning, clinging to the streets like gauze, softening every edge. Her window pane glistened with dew. Somewhere in the distance, a bell chimed once, not from a church, but from the sea. A buoy, perhaps, drifting too close to the shore. She packed a small satchel, a flashlight, a notebook, a thermos of tea, and a soft scarf her grandmother had knitted. It still smelled faintly of lavender, and somehow she felt safer with it around her shoulders. Outside, the world was still asleep. Not a soul stirred as she made her way toward the shore. The tide had receded again, unnaturally far. The rocks at the base of the cliff were dry, even brittle beneath her feet. As she approached the stone ring where she had found the tunnel, she noticed something new. Footprints, faint, nearly washed away by the wind, but unmistakably human. Barefoot, leading to the entrance. The air shifted as she stepped into the circle. The world felt quieter here, as though the stones themselves were holding their breath. She knelt by the tunnel and peered inside. It was larger than she remembered. Not a natural cave, but a hallway. Narrow, low-ceilinged, descending into the earth. The carved walls bore more of the unreadable script, though now she saw something curious. Thin grooves in the stone, like rails or channels, as though water or light had once flowed through them. Taking a breath, she clicked on her flashlight and stepped inside. The walls closed in around her gently, not oppressively, but intimately. The air was warmer here, rich with the scent of ancient wood and the faintest trace of something metallic, iron, perhaps, or salt-rusted chains. As she walked deeper, her footsteps echoed softly. The sound didn't travel far, though. It seemed to get absorbed into the stone. Every 10 feet or so, the walls pulsed faintly with moisture, glimmering in the beam of her light. And then she came to a doorway. It was wooden, bound with thick, corroded hinges. But it wasn't locked. She hesitated, fingers grazing the surface. Carved into the wood were 3 words, clear and deliberate. Do not wake. Eleanor's pulse fluttered, but not from fear, from memory. The phrase was familiar. She had read it before. She flipped open her notebook and turned to a passage she had copied from her grandfather's journal. There's something down there. Something older than the sea, wrapped in silence. They kept it dreaming. That's what the light was for. Not a beacon for ships, but a warning to the earth. Do not wake what dreams beneath. She pushed the door open. The room beyond was low and circular, carved entirely from the bedrock. In its center sat a stone table, and upon it, a lantern, smaller than the one in the lighthouse, but unmistakably similar. It was lit. The flame within gave off no heat. It flickered gently, casting no shadow. And beside it sat a book, not a journal, not a printed volume, a ledger of names. She approached and opened it. The pages were filled with signatures, some from centuries past, some as recent as the 1980s. Each name was followed by a date, a brief phrase, and a mark. Most of the phrases were cryptic. Came seeking silence. Heard it breathing. Lantern flickered. Saw it. Do not wake. The dream is not ours. Her grandfather's name was there, too. Franklin Fletcher, August 14th, 1956. He sleeps beneath the hill. Eleanor sat on the edge of the stone bench that lined the wall. She felt no fear. Just a heavy quiet, like the space was filled with ancient listening. The flame in the lantern didn't move, even as she exhaled. It watched her. Or rather, it felt like it did. And then the air changed. Not colder, not warmer, just deeper, as if the tunnel behind her had grown longer, or the ceiling above her slightly higher. A deep vibration passed through the floor, not violent, but steady, rhythmic, like the slow, distant breathing of something immense, not awake, not aware, just dreaming. And then the flame flickered. only once. But it was enough, because as it did, Eleanor heard something soft just at the edge of perception. A voice, or not quite a voice, more like the memory of one, humming through the stone. Lanterns burn so the dreamer sleeps. She stood slowly, unsure if the words had come from her own mind. The stillness returned, but it was not the same. It was no longer waiting. It was watching. She backed out of the chamber carefully, never turning her back on the flame. The tunnel behind her seemed shorter now, as though it had shifted during her stay. When she emerged into daylight, the wind struck her skin like a shock. She hadn't realized how deep into the earth she had gone. The sea was higher now, the stone ring nearly submerged, and from the corner of her eye, she thought she saw someone standing at the top of the cliff. A dark figure watching her. But when she looked again, there was nothing. Only the lighthouse, still, silent, and the faintest curl of smoke rising from its tower. The climb back up the cliff was slow. Eleanor's legs felt heavy, not just from exertion, but from something else. Like the pressure of the deep had followed her, clinging to her ankles and shoulders. Her hands trembled faintly, though she wasn't cold. Her mind was clear, but her body seemed to lag behind. She returned to the inn just as the first hints of rain began to touch the rooftops. The sky had turned to pewter, and the air smelled of seaweed and iron. Clouds rolled inland like slow waves, muffling the world with their weight. The woman at the front desk, the innkeeper who had rarely spoken, looked at Eleanor with unusual attention as she passed. A glance that lingered, not curious, knowing. Back in her room, she wrapped herself in a blanket and sat at the desk, notebook open before her. Her tea had gone cold, untouched since the morning. The pages of her journal were beginning to fill. Sketches of tunnels, pieces of strange inscriptions, fragments of sentences whispered in the dark. She wrote, "There is a language beneath the stone, not written, not spoken, felt. It hums in the marrow. In sleep, it speaks clearer. But I'm still awake." Her pen hovered over the page. Then, slowly, she wrote, "The lanterns keep it dreaming." That night, Eleanor dreamed. Not a nightmare, not even unsettling, just still. She stood in the lantern room of the lighthouse. It was empty, but not abandoned. Clean, orderly, as though someone had just stepped out. The lantern burned, and the flame bent slowly, as if drawn toward something in the east. The window was open. Outside, the sea was black and endless, and on its surface floated a single ship, unmoving, shrouded in fog. A ship with no lights, no sails, only a mast from which hung a bell. And as she watched, the bell rang once, a sound so deep it shook the bones of the dream itself. When Eleanor woke, the clock read 3:14 a.m. She sat up slowly, heart steady, and listened. The inn was quiet. The fog pressed against the window like breath. She reached for the stack of letters she had ignored on her first day. Bound in ribbon, faded with age, they were addressed to a single name, Thomas Delaney. Some were postmarked. Others had no return address. She opened the first one. "Thomas, you never wrote back. I came up the hill again last night. The lantern was burning, though the tower was locked. I thought I heard your boots on the stairs. Please write. Tell me you're still watching. M." The next. It started again. The lights off the reef. They pulse now. Not random, but in patterns. The wind carries voices. "I thought I saw you in the surf. I miss you." Dozens more followed. They told of strange events, long nights, changes in the soil. They told of Thomas's silence, of the town's forgetting, of something shifting beneath the lighthouse. And then, the final letter. Different from the rest. The handwriting was rougher, desperate, He never left the hill. I've seen him through the glass, even when the tower was empty. His lantern is not his own anymore. If you're reading this, if you're here, do not wake him. Do not light the flame again. He's not asleep because he's tired. He sleeps because it's the only way the dream can remain outside the world. Please, remember what the light is for. That day, Eleanor walked the edges of the town. The people avoided her gaze. The man in the tweed coat was gone from the dining hall. The librarian closed early. A sign hung on the door. Due to tides, access restricted. The sea had risen again. The tunnel was gone, submerged. But the lighthouse stood still. That evening, as dusk turned to deep gray, she returned to the hill. The path was quiet. Trees leaned over the trail, branches gently brushing her shoulders. The wind whispered low, almost kind. When she reached the top, the lighthouse door was open. She hadn't opened it. Inside, the staircase stretched upward in the gathering dark. No lantern, no light. She climbed slowly, and at the top, in the lantern room, she found the chair. The same one from her dream, empty, but warm. And then, footsteps behind her. Not loud, not aggressive. Just the sound of someone who belonged there. She turned, slowly. No one. Only the silence of a place long left behind by the world. But the lantern sat on the table, and as she stepped closer, she saw her own reflection in its glass. And something else. Another reflection beside her, faint. A man in a long coat, holding a key, then gone. But the feeling remained. Not menace, not even warning, just presence, and something older than both. Eleanor sat in the chair. The wind sighed through the broken slats. The sea stretched below, calm and unknowable, and slowly, without touching it, the lantern began to glow. A soft, steady pulse. Not a flame, a memory of one. The lantern didn't burn. It shimmered. A soft golden thrum hovered within its glass, as if light had chosen to remember itself rather than be reborn. Eleanor watched in silence. The hush of the sea below folding gently around the tower. Outside, the fog thickened again, but not blindly. It crept with purpose. It wrapped the lighthouse like a veil, and within it, something moved. She leaned toward the window. Far below, near the base of the hill where sand met stone, a figure stood still in the mist. Not walking, not waiting, just present. A tall man. His coat hung long and dark, stiff in the breeze. In one hand, he held a lantern. The other she couldn't see. The beam from her own lantern, if it could be called a beam, didn't reach him, and yet she had the distinct impression he was looking up at her. She didn't wave. She didn't move. She only watched, and as she did, she felt a slow, growing pull. Not fear, something stranger. Recognition. He turned and walked away, vanishing behind the outcropping of rock near the southern side of the hill. When she looked back at the lantern, it had dimmed slightly. Not flickering, just adjusting. That night, Eleanor returned to the inn in a trance-like stillness. She lit the small oil lamp by her bed and opened her grandfather's journal again. Pages she hadn't marked before seemed to call out to her now, as if their ink had grown darker. One passage stood alone, unadorned. The watchers do not guide the living. They guard the boundary. Another entry beneath it. I think I met one today. He asked nothing of me, only stood in silence, and still I felt as though I owed him something. Eleanor touched the page softly, her finger tracing the edge of the sentence. The next morning, she made her way to the southern edge of the hill. The cliffs there were steep, jagged. Years of wind had shaped the stones into sharp skeletal spires. Between them, narrow paths wound downward, paths not listed on any map. She followed one. It led to a place she had not seen before, a small alcove half hidden by ivy and sand where an iron gate stood ajar. Beyond it, stairs, descending. Stone steps smoothed by generations of use. She followed them. The air grew cooler. The sound of the ocean softened. The passage leveled out into a narrow hallway carved deep into the cliffside. And then, voices. Faint, like wind caught in the hollows of broken flutes. Eleanor paused. Her breath held. And she heard, "She carries the light." A pause. Then another voice, gentler, closer. She does not yet know what that means. She stepped forward. The hallway opened into a round chamber similar to the one beneath the stone ring. But here, there were statues, 5 of them. Tall, cloaked figures carved from smooth obsidian, each holding a lantern shaped like her own. Their faces were blank. They stood in a circle facing inward. In the center, a stone plinth, and atop it a bowl of water. Still, clear. She approached. When she looked into the water, she did not see her reflection. She saw the lighthouse, literature, and standing inside, herself, seated in the chair, a soft glow radiating from her hands, and then beside her, the man. No face, no features, just a shape, watching. She stepped back. The room held its silence. One of the statues, the one directly behind the plinth, had something carved into its base. She knelt and brushed away the dust. To stand watch is to forget yourself. As she rose, something shifted behind her. A breeze, a whisper. She turned. No one. But on the edge of the chamber, the air rippled, as if the stone itself had briefly breathed. She left slowly, carefully retracing her steps. The climb back up to the lighthouse was quiet. Birds circled above, their cries muffled in the thickening mist. Back at the inn, she asked the silent woman behind the counter a question for the first time. "Have you ever seen him?" The woman didn't ask who. She only replied in a voice like dry paper, "He only shows himself to those who are ready to forget." Forget what? Who they were before they were called. That evening, Eleanor returned once more to the tower. The wind had changed. It carried with it the scent of rain, but no storm. Inside the lantern room, the flame was waiting for her. And this time, the chair was not empty. The man was there, still, silent. Holding a second lantern, he didn't speak. He simply stood and slowly extended his hand, not offering the lantern, but inviting her to sit. Eleanor hesitated in the doorway. The man in the chair did not move, and yet the lantern in his hand flickered gently, in rhythm with her breath. He was neither young nor old, ageless in the way stone or rivers are. His presence carried no menace, only gravity, the kind of weight that cannot be measured. And he waited. For what, she didn't know. Slowly, Eleanor stepped inside. The lantern room was quiet, but not empty. It held something that had not been there before, a fullness, a sense of attention. The man raised his hand slightly, not in greeting, but in acknowledgement. Then, with deliberate grace, he placed his lantern on the table opposite hers. 2 lights, 1 memory, 1 question. Eleanor sat. The wood of the chair was warm. She exhaled softly and closed her eyes, and the lights pulsed. Not like fire, not like electricity, but like breath, like heartbeat. Her thoughts began to drift, not away, but deeper inward. And slowly the world shifted. She was no longer in the tower. She stood on a shore that was not made of sand, but of pages. Thousands of them, fluttering beneath her feet in a windless breeze. Above, the sky rippled with ink, and the stars were words. Around her, silhouettes moved in slow orbits, men and women holding lanterns that floated just above their hands, each one glowing with a different hue. Blue, amber, silver. One shimmered like frost. Another flickered like memory. A voice spoke behind her. It was not the man from the tower. It was her grandfather. "You found it." She turned. He stood not as she remembered him, tired and thin, but younger, stronger, with eyes like polished glass and a steady voice. You followed the question. Most don't. Most stop at the light. Eleanor wanted to speak, but no words came. The lantern in her hands, for now she held one too, glowed gently, its light neither warm nor cold. It simply was. "There is no ending," her grandfather said, "only choosing where to stop walking." "And if I keep walking?" she managed. He nodded toward the sea, a horizon made not of water but shadow and thought. Something vast moved just beneath it, the shape of a dream coiled around silence. Then you become the keeper. A pause. But keep what? The memory of what must sleep. Eleanor felt the truth of it, even if she couldn't explain it. The lantern pulsed once more, and she was back in the tower. The man had vanished. Only the two lanterns remained. The air was still, but something had changed. She stood slowly and walked to the window. Grendel's Bay glowed faintly beneath her, a soft, dreaming town wrapped in mist. But now, Eleanor saw the patterns. The way the light from each chimney moved in rhythm with the tide. The way fog traced invisible paths through the alleys. The way certain windows remained dark, even at midday. This place was not just haunted. It was held, cradled by something older than its buildings, older than memory. She stepped down from the tower just as the first light of dawn spilled through the clouds. The streets were empty, but not lifeless. She passed the inn. The door was closed. The woman behind the counter was gone. No luggage in the room, no name in the guest book. As if she had never been. She passed the library. A paper sign hung in the window. Closed until further notice. She pressed her hand to the door. No response. Only a faint warmth in the wood, like someone had just touched it from the other side. The sea was calm that morning. Still, Eleanor walked the long path to Lantern Hill. The breeze lifted the edges of her coat like fingers, gently testing its weight. The birds flew lower now, slower. And as she reached the summit, she understood. She was not here to solve a mystery. She was here to remember it. The door to the lighthouse creaked open before she touched it. Inside, the lantern waited. And beside it, a book. Her name already written on the first page. The ink on the page was fresh. Eleanor ran her fingertips gently across the surface of the open book. The paper was thick, fibrous, bound in dark green leather that smelled faintly of salt and ash. Her name sat alone at the top of the first page, Eleanor Fletcher. No date, no title, no entries. Beneath it, a single, fine line waited, ready to accept the story. She looked up. The lantern glowed softly, casting no shadow. The light had changed since her first arrival. It now moved with her breath, matched the rhythm of her heart. It was alive, not as a flame is alive, but as memory is, quiet, stubborn, unrelenting. She sat in the chair once more. There was no pen, no ink, and yet she began to write. Words flowed, not from her mind, but from a place older, deeper. She didn't think. She recalled. The page filled itself slowly, gently, as if the story had always lived there just beneath the surface, waiting for her hand. The lantern is not a beacon. It is not a warning. It is not even light. It is a promise that something vast and dreaming remains asleep only so long as we remember to keep watch. It stirs sometimes, when the sea grows too quiet, when the wind stops asking questions, when the names are forgotten and the hill is left alone too long. I am here to remember, not for myself, for it. She stopped, not because she had finished, but because the lantern dimmed, not out of loss, but rest. She stood and turned toward the staircase. The light followed her, a gentle glow that hovered behind, illuminating just enough to guide her downward. The stones no longer creaked beneath her feet. They accepted her, held her weight differently. Outside, the sun had begun to rise. A gold ribbon stretched across the horizon, separating sea from sky. The fog thinned, peeled away like sleep from waking eyes. Grendel's Bay looked almost ordinary. Almost. Eleanor walked the perimeter of the hill, past old moorings and broken benches. She came to the far side, where the cliff bent sharply downward toward the rocks. There, nestled among weathered boulders, sat something new. A bench, wooden, hand-carved, untouched by moss or decay. And on it, engraved in the same clean, looping script she had seen in the ledger room. For those who kept the light burning, she sat, and for the first time since arriving, she felt no pull to move, no tension in her thoughts. Only silence, software complete. The sea below breathed slowly. The rocks glistened. The lighthouse stood behind her, watching not the shore, but the dream beneath. She thought of the man, the one in the lantern room, the one in the fog. Was he a memory, a symbol, or had he simply been her? Some version of herself left behind by time, waiting for her to arrive. There were no answers, only the understanding that not every story needs one. Some stories ask only to be told. That evening, as the final light bled into the ocean, Eleanor walked once more into the tower. The lantern greeted her. The journal waited. And as the fog crept in again, gently, respectfully, she felt something settle within her, like a stone sinking to rest at the bottom of a still lake. And there, in the hush of wind and water, Eleanor Fletcher became what she had always been meant to be. Not a visitor, not a seeker, a keeper of the hill, of the light, of the dream. And outside, below, the townsfolk dreamed softly in their homes, never knowing that the light in the tower was watching not for them, but for what slept beneath them. It had been 3 days since Eleanor last left the lighthouse. Time had begun to stretch and fold around her. The world outside still moved. Fishermen still left before dawn. Boats still creaked in the harbor. Fog still rolled in with the tide. But for Eleanor, the hours passed in soft waves of stillness. She rose with the light, slept with the lantern. A rhythm, not a routine. And the book, the keeper's book, had begun to change. New pages turned themselves. New names appeared. Some she recognized faintly from the letters she'd read in the inn. Others were unfamiliar, as if they belonged to people who had never touched the town, but had once, briefly, dreamed of it. But it was the most recent name that caught her attention. It had not been there before. Matthew Carter. June 18th. He follows the wrong flame. She stared at it for a long time. The ink was still wet. She flipped to the next page. Blank. The one after that. Blank again. But on the third, a name began to form before her eyes, the ink etching itself in looping black strokes, like a quill pulled by an unseen hand. Sarah Wren. June 19th. She left the door open. Eleanor stood and moved to the window. Down below, near the base of Lantern Hill, 2 figures were walking the edge of the cliffs. One was tall, wearing a dark coat. The other was smaller, pausing often to kneel and examine the rocks. Newcomers. They hadn't come through the town. She would have heard. They had found their own way in, or perhaps the hill had opened for them. The next morning, Eleanor made her way down into the town for the first time in days. The air smelled different, brighter, crisper, despite the ever-present fog. She stopped by the library, still closed, but a note had been added to the door, hastily written, "Gone to the inlet. If you need me, wait for the second tide. Harold, the second tide." She didn't fully understand, but she remembered a passage in her grandfather's journal. When the second tide rises, the reef path appears. Only then can you follow the ones who don't knock. She headed toward the cliffs. By mid-afternoon, the ocean had retreated in that strange, unnatural way she was beginning to accept. Not as magic, but as the world simply remembering itself. The rocks shimmered with salt, and where there had once been only crashing waves, a narrow, curved path now appeared between the stones, just visible in the distance, arcing toward a sea cave tucked low into the cliff face. She walked it, carefully. The water lapped gently at her ankles, though it never rose above her steps. The sea seemed to know who she was. The cave was deep, wider than expected, and lit, faintly, from within. The smell of old wax and brine hung in the air, mixed with something older, a sweetness like dried herbs. As she moved forward, her eyes adjusted. Candles, dozens of them, set into small alcoves in the rock, each one flickering gently, though no match had touched them. In the center of the cave stood a stone pedestal, and beside it, Harold. He turned as she entered, his face both relieved and cautious. "I was hoping it would be you." Eleanor approached. "Who are they?" she asked. "The names," he replied, motioning toward the open ledger she hadn't noticed before. A smaller one, separate from the lighthouse record. Visitors, drifters, dreamers who heard the pull but never learned the shape of the door. They came anyway? They always do. Harold walked to the back of the cave and knelt before a carved panel. It showed the lighthouse in perfect detail, and beneath it, winding roots that spread outward into the deep. Shapes floated among them, not people. Not exactly, but impressions of them. "They see the light, but not the lantern," he said, "and they follow it the way moths do." Eleanor looked at the carving more closely. One of the shapes was missing, just a blank space, a hollow among the others. "Someone left," she said quietly. Harold nodded. "Yes, long ago, took their light with them." "What happened?" He didn't answer. Instead, he turned back to the pedestal and handed her a page. It had no name, only a message. "The sleeper stirs more often now. The lines are fraying. A new lantern must be made." Eleanor looked up. "A new lantern?" "Yours," Harold said softly. "The others, they've served their time. But this place, this threshold, needs a keeper who still dreams." The cave grew quiet again, and for the first time, Eleanor felt the weight of what had been given to her. Not a task, not a burden, a trust. She looked toward the sea beyond the mouth of the cave. The fog curled around the rocks like fingers too tired to grasp. She stepped to the edge, and in the distance, faint but clear, a ship's bell rang once, deep, slow, calling. That night, the sea did not sleep. It breathed slowly, in long, low surges that curled against the rocks like whispered thoughts. Eleanor sat on the bench just beneath the lighthouse, a wool blanket draped around her shoulders, the wind brushing her cheeks like soft hands. The lantern tower above her pulsed gently with light, not visible to the town below, but radiant in the spaces between thought and silence. And below, far below, the second tide came. The ocean pulled back once more, slower this time, more cautious. And when it did, the reef path reappeared, gleaming with salt, mossy and slick. 2 figures stood on it now, the same 2 she had seen from the lighthouse window, the tall man in the coat and the shorter woman with the careful steps. They made their way along the path, not hurried, not hesitant, as if they knew this place, even if they'd never touched its stones before. And with them came something else. The light. Not from the lighthouse, but from beneath it. A low phosphorescent shimmer began to bloom from the base of the cliff, as if the earth itself was remembering how to glow. It moved like breath, in slow pulses, casting a pale green hue over the waves. Harold appeared beside her, his coat damp with mist. "They've stepped into the field," he said softly. "It'll test them now." "The field?" she asked. He pointed. "The threshold between dream and waking. The sea remembers. So does the land. But memory can't protect unless it's passed forward." Eleanor looked down again. The newcomers had paused at the base of the hill. Sarah Wren knelt beside a pool of shallow water, her hand hovering above it. She seemed to be listening not to the wind, but to something deeper. Matthew Carter stood just behind her, holding a small device, a recorder perhaps. He pressed a button and brought it to his lips. They had come prepared to study. But this was not a place for science, not the way they understood it. "Should I speak to them?" Eleanor asked. Harold shook his head. "Not yet. If they're meant to see, they'll see. If not, they'll leave." "Or?" she asked. He didn't answer, but he didn't need to. The next morning brought unusual clarity. The fog had lifted entirely. Sunlight filtered through the trees like golden dust. For the first time, the town looked like something from a painting. Vivid, warm, quiet in a way that felt intentional. Eleanor walked through Grendel's Bay like a visitor. The windows were open. Children played in distant yards. Chimes swayed from porches, but none of them looked at her. It was as if she moved just outside their knowing, not invisible but no longer of the town. The library door was ajar. She stepped inside. Dust motes danced in the air, lit by beams of morning light. The familiar scent of parchment and seawater lingered. A book sat open on the main desk, not one she remembered. Its pages were blank, save for a single phrase written at the top of the first page. The sleeper dreams in circles. Those who enter the circle must leave something behind, and beneath that a question had been scrawled in a tighter hand. "What have you left behind, Eleanor Fletcher?" She closed the book. Outside, the sea bell rang again, one long toll. She returned to the hill. The newcomers were there, standing at the base of the lighthouse, looking up. Sarah Wren turned first. Her eyes were bright but tired. "You're the one from the stories," she said without preamble. "The keeper." Eleanor didn't nod, didn't confirm. She only said, "Why are you here?" Matthew stepped forward. "To listen," he said. "To document, to understand what happened to the others who came before." "Which others?" she asked. Sarah opened her notebook. "The missing ones, all the way back to the 1930s. Every 10 years or so, someone comes to this place and isn't seen again." Eleanor looked toward the cliffside. "And what do you think happened to them?" Sarah hesitated. "I don't know. But we saw the light. On the first night. Just a shimmer at first. But we both dreamed the same dream." She glanced at Matthew, who nodded. "The ship," he said quietly. "The one with no sails." Eleanor felt something stir inside her, a quiet recognition. "You saw it too," Sarah whispered. The bell rang, Matthew added. Harold's voice came from behind them. Then you've already crossed." They turned, startled. He stood with hands tucked behind his back, eyes calm. "This isn't a place you visit," he said. "It's a place that chooses you. You stepped through the door. Now you must decide if you stay or leave something behind, so others may stay instead." Sarah's breath caught. "I don't understand." "You will," Eleanor said, "but not all at once. This place gives its truth slowly like the tide." They stood in silence. Then Sarah asked, "What happens if we stay?" Harold replied without hesitation, "You forget who you were, so you can remember what you're meant to be." A wind passed gently through the pines. The sea, for once, was utterly still. The lantern atop the tower flared, just once, and the door creaked open. Sarah and Matthew didn't enter the lighthouse immediately. They stood in the threshold, as if they could feel the pressure change within. The subtle gravity shift of crossing from one world into another. Eleanor remained by the door, watching them, saying nothing. The lantern's light from above filtered down the stairwell in quiet pulses, as though aware of its audience. Finally, Sarah stepped inside. Matthew followed. The stairwell seemed steeper to them than it had to Eleanor, the steps more worn, the climb more uncertain. As they reached the lantern room, they paused. The air was warm, not stale, not dusty, fresh, like breath. The two lanterns sat where Eleanor had left them, but now there was a third, small, brass-bound, faintly glowing, waiting. Eleanor gestured toward it. "For you," she said. Sarah stepped forward and reached out. Her fingers hovered over the lantern's handle, and then stopped. "It's warm," she whispered, "like it knows me." Eleanor nodded. "That's what it does. It knows what part of you is still remembering, even after you've forgotten everything else." Matthew remained at the window, silent. Then he asked, "What's below?" Eleanor turned to him. "The archive." Harold, who had followed quietly, answered, "Where the memories go when they're not ready to be lost." Matthew frowned. "Memories of the people?" "No," Harold said. "Memories of the place." They descended again, but not back to town. Instead, Eleanor led them to a hidden stairwell behind the main spiral. One carved into the thick inner wall of the lighthouse. Few noticed it. Fewer used it. The passage twisted down beneath the base of the tower, deeper than logic allowed. Salt dripped from the stones. The air turned cooler, but never cold. Just preserved. They emerged in a vast underground chamber, circular, endless in feel, shelves upon shelves of objects, stones, ropes, lantern parts, fragments of old letters, rusted keys, cracked lenses, journals whose ink had faded into memory. No system, and yet no disorder. Everything was exactly where it needed to be. In the center of the room sat a shallow pool, the same still water Eleanor had once seen in her dream. But now it shimmered, alive with images just beneath the surface. Blurred glimpses of old hands turning knobs, of watchers walking cliff paths, of shadows whispering against stairwells. Sarah knelt beside the water. "It's beautiful," she murmured. "Is it alive?" "No," Eleanor said. "It remembers what was alive." Matthew circled the room, recording faint audio from the walls, noting where the sound of their footsteps shifted. "This is impossible," he muttered. "The geography? It doesn't make sense. There's no space under the lighthouse for all of this." Harold smiled faintly. "Sense doesn't apply here. Only story does." Sarah turned toward Eleanor. "You live here now?" Eleanor nodded. "I am what my grandfather became, what Delaney was before him. I keep the light. I keep the threshold. And when you're gone?" Eleanor looked down at the pool. Then at the small lantern Sarah now carried in her hands. "That depends," she said softly, "on whether someone else remembers why the light was lit." Later that evening, they returned to the surface. The town had grown even quieter. The fog had returned, but it no longer pressed close. It hovered, respectfully, like a crowd standing at the edge of a sacred ceremony. Eleanor walked them back toward the harbor. At the dock, an empty skiff waited. No ropes held it. No oars sat inside, but it remained still against the wooden slats, bobbing gently with the current. Sarah turned to her. "Is this ours?" Eleanor didn't answer. She looked to Harold. He stepped forward, eyes kind. "You've seen the light. You've heard the bell. You've touched the memory. Now you decide." "Decide what?" "Whether to carry it forward or forget." Sarah looked at Matthew. He looked down at the small recorder in his hand. Then, wordlessly, he stepped into the skiff and placed the recorder at its bow. "I'll remember," he said, "but I won't return." Sarah turned to Eleanor. Her voice trembled. "And me?" Eleanor reached out and touched the lantern in her hands. It pulsed once, gently, like a final breath. "You already have," Eleanor whispered. Sarah stepped into the skiff. The fog closed around them, and in a matter of moments the boat was gone. No splash, no wake, just stillness, and the echo of a bell. Back at the lighthouse, Eleanor opened the keeper's book. 2 new entries had appeared. Matthew Carter chose memory, left the light behind, but carried its song. Sarah Wren chose the lantern, now walks the circle. Eleanor closed the book. The lantern flickered. Outside, the town dreamed, and beneath it, the sleeper turned once in its vast, quiet dreaming, not toward waking, but deeper still. Kept, remembered, watched. The following nights grew heavier, not with sound, but with presence. Grendel's Bay settled into a kind of suspended quiet, as though the entire town had fallen into a shared, slow dream. Children no longer played after dusk. Lanterns burned longer in the windows, but their flames flickered nervously. A hush had wrapped itself around the harbor and wouldn't let go. The lighthouse stood as it always had, alone and constant. But even Eleanor could feel the shift. The sleeper beneath the hill was stirring again. Not fully, not yet, but enough for the earth to feel the tremor in its bones. She began waking at odd hours. 3 o'clock, 4:12. Always just before the tide turned. Always with the same taste in her mouth, salt and something older, like the cold scent of a cave long sealed. Harold returned less often to the tower. He had grown pale, thin, his presence like smoke that refused to rise. "You've seen the signs," he said one morning as they stood by the cliff's edge. "You know what it means?" Eleanor looked out at the water. "Yes," she whispered. "They're forgetting again." She nodded. "And when they forget, it wakes." That evening, Eleanor returned to the archive beneath the lighthouse. She descended the stairs without a lantern. She no longer needed one. The walls remembered her footsteps. The stone grew warmer as she passed, like the tower itself was holding its breath. She found the journal again, her grandfather's, and there, hidden in the crease of its final page, was something she had missed. A letter, folded twice, tucked flat, the paper delicate and brittle with time. She unfolded it carefully. "Ellie, if you're reading this, you've gone farther than I ever dared. I'm sorry I didn't tell you more when I was alive. I thought I could protect you by silence. But the truth is, it only waits longer when we pretend it's gone. The dreamer beneath the hill is not a monster. It is not evil. It is not even awake. It is an old, old story, And like all old stories, it was buried because people forgot what they owed it. Long ago, before the lighthouse, before the name Grendel's Bay, this place was a door. The sea came here not just for salt and harvests, but for the trade. They gave the dreamer memory. In return, it kept the other dreams away. But memory fades. And when it does, the door weakens. My time is done, Ellie. But yours is only beginning. If you must choose, choose with your whole heart. Remember for all of us, Granddad. She pressed the letter to her chest and sat quietly for some time. The air in the archive did not move, and yet she could feel it shifting, listening. She spoke aloud, not a whisper, not a cry, just a steady voice. I'll keep the story. The pool of water at the center of the chamber shimmered once, rippled, then stilled. Later that night, as the fog returned in thick, slow curtains, Eleanor stood again at the top of Lantern Hill. The town slept below, and beneath that sleep, the earth held its breath. She turned toward the sea and saw a ship on the horizon. The same ship, the one with no sails, no name, no sound, the one she'd seen in dreams. But now it was closer, too close, and on the bow, a figure, tall, cloaked, face hidden in the folds of a shadow that never moved. The bell rang once, and this time the sound reached deep. Eleanor felt it inside her bones. Inside the tower, the lantern sputtered, not extinguished, but flickering. The boundary was thinning. She descended into the archive once more, faster now, the stairwell trembling faintly beneath her feet. The journal's pages had turned themselves. A new entry had written itself in her hand. She hadn't written it. The flame bends eastward now. It calls to what has no name. It remembers only that it was once forgotten, and that forgetting hurt. Beneath it a line. She must choose soon, or the tide will choose for her. By morning, the sky had turned the color of old bone. The sea was too still. Harold stood at the foot of the tower, leaning heavily on his cane. He looked tired, translucent. You know what comes next, he said softly. Eleanor nodded. I need to go to the threshold. He didn't argue. He only held out something in his hand, a small brass key, the same key she had once seen reflected in the lantern's glass. She took it and turned toward the old path, the one hidden in the trees that led behind the cliffs, beyond the town's edge, down toward the root of the dream, the place where the very first keeper once stood. The threshold was not a place. It was a moment, a breath, a decision. Eleanor found herself standing before a flat stone set into the ground, older than the lighthouse, older than the town, older than names. In its surface was a keyhole. She knelt, heart steady, and turned the key. The earth didn't shake. The fog didn't scream. There was no light, no flash, just a slow opening, a whisper of hinges older than time. A stone door slid open into the hillside, revealing a corridor not made of stone, but of woven memory. Flickering images, echoes, sighs caught in walls of pulsing light. And from within came breath. Not wind, breath. The dreamer had turned and was listening. The corridor swallowed sound. Eleanor stepped inside, one foot after the other, each movement muffled by something not physical. A kind of dreaming silence that clung to her skin and curled inside her ears. The passage was lit from within, but not by fire. The walls pulsed faintly, like soft breathing, veins of gentle light weaving in patterns too slow to follow. She couldn't tell if she was walking forward in space or downward in time. The deeper she went, the more the world around her began to change. The corridor gave way to a chamber, vast and open, but boundless. There were no walls, no ceiling, only mist and light, and the feeling of something enormous just beyond the edges of her perception. It wasn't darkness that surrounded her. It was unwrittenness, a place where stories hadn't yet taken shape. And in the center of this empty space floated a shape, the sleeper. It was not a body. It was not even a being. It was story. Coiled, ancient, dreaming. Its presence filled the air not with fear, but with immense aching stillness. Eleanor felt her own heartbeat slow, as if being asked to listen, truly listen. For the first time. And she did. From the silence came thought, and from that thought, shape. Not words, not voices, but memory, a river of knowing. She closed her eyes, and the dreamer's memories began to unfold. A world before this one. A coast without name, where people once knelt before the sea and sang to it. The songs were not prayers, they were exchanges. Memory for safety, stories for stillness. And from the deepest parts of the sea it came, not to harm, not to take, but to hold. It asked only to be remembered, and for centuries it was. The people lit lanterns not to ward it off, but to keep its dream unbroken. Each flame a small kindness or a promise. We have not forgotten. But time moved forward and people changed. The stories faded, the lanterns dimmed, and with them so did the dream. Now, when the dreamer stirred, the sea shuddered, and when it sighed, ships vanished in fog, not in anger, but in confusion. It did not know whether it was still welcome, whether it had already awakened, whether it was still loved. Eleanor opened her eyes. Tears fell silently down her cheeks, not from sadness, but from understanding. This was not a monster. It was a wound left open too long, a grief no longer recognized, a child that had outlived its parents and no longer knew if it was real. She took a step closer. The dreamer did not move, not in any physical sense, but she felt the great eye of its being turn gently toward her. You remember, the thought wasn't words, it was the shape behind them. She nodded, and in that moment, something passed between them. A knowing, quiet and unbreakable. A promise. She would not let it be forgotten again, not while she lived, not while the light could still burn. When she returned to the threshold, the sky above Grendel's Bay was breaking, not with light, but with clarity. The fog had pulled back to the sea, resting on its haunches like an old dog content to wait. Harold stood at the cliff's edge. He turned as she approached. His eyes, once glassy and thin, now shone with calm. "It saw you." She nodded. "I saw it. Did it speak?" "No," she said. "But it remembered. And I listened." He smiled. "There are few greater kindnesses." That night, Eleanor climbed to the top of the lighthouse one final time. The tower pulsed gently, the stones now warm to the touch. She sat at the desk beside the lantern and opened the keeper's book. A new page awaited. And for the first time, she wrote not as a visitor, not even as a witness, but as a part of the story. The sleeper still dreams. The sea is still watching. The light is still lit. I have entered the threshold. I have seen the shape of silence. I have held memory in my hands. And now I will keep it. Not to control, not to warn, but to remember. At the bottom of the page, she signed her name. Eleanor Fletcher, keeper of the lantern outside. The wind passed gently through the pine trees. Below, the town slept. And far beneath the roots of Lantern Hill, the dreamer sighed once more, not in pain, not in fear, but in comfort. A remembered story, a dream still held, a light still burning. Seasons changed slowly in Grendel's Bay. The world beyond the town hurried forward. Roads paved, cities expanded, screens flickered in every home. But on the mist-bound coast where the lighthouse stood, time did not race. It curled and lingered, like sea foam around a rock, like a candle flame in a quiet room. Years passed, but the lantern never went out. Eleanor Fletcher kept the light. She tended it gently, not as a guardian, but as a companion. Every morning she walked the hilltop path, collected sea-worn stones left in rings by the tide, and left new ones in their place. Every evening she sat in the lantern room, writing in the keeper's book, recording small details, weather patterns, strange dreams, names whispered by the wind. She grew older, though the hill never seemed to notice. The town came to speak of her with a hush. "The woman on the hill," children whispered. "She listens to the sea." Tourists came and went, often seeing only mist and an old tower. But now and then, someone would hear the bell. Someone would see the light not from the top of the tower, but within their own dreams. And those who returned changed. Gentler, quieter, spoke of peace they couldn't explain. Some left offerings near the shore, candles, poems, feathers, stones. All were accepted. The town slowly remembered. Not everything, not the whole truth, but enough. Enough to keep the flame steady. One day, many years later, Eleanor sat at the edge of the cliff, wrapped in the same shawl her grandmother had once knit. The sky was pale and wide. The sea had drawn itself far out, low and reflective like an old mirror. She heard footsteps behind her and smiled before she turned. A young woman approached, maybe 25, maybe younger, with a leather satchel and salt, stiff hair. Her boots were worn. Her coat carried a faded library pin. She looked like Eleanor had once looked. "Is this the place?" the girl asked. Eleanor nodded. "The one from the letters?" Eleanor stood. Her knees ached, but her voice was steady. "You heard it?" The girl smiled, a little embarrassed. "I dreamed it." Eleanor held out her hand. "You're just in time." They climbed the lighthouse together. The young woman, her name was Leah, asked few questions. She watched. She listened. She walked with a kind of reverence Eleanor hadn't seen in years. At the top of the stairs, the lantern pulsed as gently as ever. The room was warm. The air smelled of seagrass and old ink. Eleanor handed her the book. "Would you like to write?" Leah hesitated, then sat in the chair. She picked up the pen. The page turned itself. She wrote, "There was a light, there was a story, and I listened." Eleanor smiled. "You've already begun." That evening, Eleanor walked alone to the edge of the threshold. The hidden door that led down into the dreaming. The key still hung from her neck. She did not open it. She only knelt, placed the key gently on the stone, and whispered something no one else would hear. A name. A thank you. A promise. Then she stood, turned back toward the lighthouse one final time, and walked slowly down the hill into the darkening light. The bell rang once, not from the sea, but from the wind. They say the lantern still glows on fog-heavy nights. That if you walk the path at the right time, you may hear the ocean breathing differently. Not like waves, but like a long-forgotten lullaby. And sometimes a figure is seen on the hill. Not walking, just waiting. Not a warning, just a presence. A story that hasn't ended. A keeper who has become the light. The last page of the keeper's book was always blank, not because it had never been written on, but because it chose to remain empty, waiting for the right moment to be filled. It was said that only one sentence ever appeared there when the time was right, and only when the keeper was no longer watching the page. Leah learned this on her 3rd year atop the hill. She had taken to her new life slowly, gently, learning the rhythms of the tower, the dreams of the town, the pulse of the tide. She listened to the same wind Eleanor once had, felt the breath of the fog through the stones, heard the silence beneath the earth, and understood it for what it was. Not emptiness, but listening. The people of Grendel's Bay began to know her, not in name, but in presence. She became part of the town's mythos, the young woman who tended the light, the one who wandered at twilight, the one who never left. She left things, though. Little offerings, a feather on the windowsill of a widow's home, a sea-polished coin in the hollow of a tree, a folded paper boat sent adrift with no destination. Every act was a word. Every word, a lantern. And the dreamer beneath the hill continued to sleep. Not because it had forgotten the world, but because the world had not yet forgotten it. One evening, long after the last visitor had come and gone, Leah stood in the lantern room just as the sun kissed the edge of the sea. She placed a small object beside the lamp, a brass compass, rusted and missing its needle. It had belonged to her grandfather, a sailor lost off this coast many years before she was born. She had never known him, and yet he had led her here, just like the dream had. The lantern pulsed softly. The wind whispered past the panes, and when she turned back to the desk, the final page in the keeper's book had changed. There, in a hand not her own, one line had appeared. The light endures, because someone still listens. She smiled, and let the page remain open. Years passed, then decades, and still the lighthouse stood. The town remained quiet, not forgotten, just peaceful. Travelers sometimes came looking for the story. Some found nothing. Others found more than they expected. A dream, a silence, a presence they couldn't name. And those few, the ones who truly heard the sea, sometimes left something behind. A lit candle in a jar, a drawing of a spiral, a line in a notebook. I saw the hill. I heard the bell, and I remember. On the rarest of nights, when the fog is thin and the stars are shy, you can still walk the path to the tower. The wind will guide you, and if your heart is quiet enough, and your breath steady, and you hold something in your memory that the world has tried to take away, the door might open for you, the light may flicker in welcome, and you may hear softly from the stone beneath your feet, "Thank you for remembering."